someone smoking a cigar. It always makes me think of Grandpa. And I picture him in a kind of a rumpled fishing hat with a stub of a cigar. And over the years, the fishing hat went away and he didn't smoke cigars anymore, but the part of that memory that has stuck around was the laughter and the storytelling. And I think back to, we were here in Hampton, and his dad, Harry, had moved into an assisted living or an apartment. What I remember is laying on the floor, and there was a little kitchen table propped up, or up against the wall with 2 chairs. Harry was on the left, Grandpa was on the right. I don't remember the stories, but I remember they were telling stories of all the silly and stupid things that they had done. And they were laughing. And they were just laughing. And you remember when, oh yeah, and it just went back and forth. And there was that laughter. And he'd kind of look over and he'd start laughing. His head would bob up and down. I remember when we would load up the minivan, we'd drive down to Arkansas. No longer in Hampton, no longer in Minneapolis, no longer in Zimmerman, but we'd drive down to Arkansas and we'd drive through the mountains. Usually we'd get in late. During those trips, we'd usually end up going to a park or one of his fishing holes, and he'd sit and watch our 3 kids, and they'd do something silly, and he'd start laughing, and then he'd start reminiscing about Peggy and my mom. And he'd talk about different times and silly things that happened when they were growing up. And it was that storytelling and it was that laughter that I always keep remembering about Grandpa. And then I think back to, it was 5 years ago, a week ago. Dad and I loaded up a motorhome and we drove down to Arkansas. And who would ever think that you'd get to take an 800-mile road trip with your 94-year-old grandpa? Now, he didn't have the fishing hat anymore. He traded that in for a more stylish wool cap. He was traveling in style. And we thought, he might end up laying in the couch. It was going to be a long trip, but the guy sat the whole time. And I never thought I'd be driving down this road again. I never thought I'd be going through, and he'd kind of chuckle, and he'd kind of laugh. We stopped for Egg McMuffins. We stopped for Culver's. It was quite a memory that we had. And then the years, in the last 5 years, there'd be phone calls. We'd talk sports. He'd tell me how great LeBron James was. I'm not a big LeBron James fan, but I'd say big Cavaliers fan at the time. Or we'd talk about the Twins, and he'd tell me how they're putting in a reliever who's probably going to blow the lead because the last 3 times he was going to do that. He loved his sports, and he liked to talk about them. But over the years, then I'd get him to talk about different stories. He'd tell the time when he was in the Navy. He was in training, and he said, they took us out on a boat, and they said I had to take the swim test. And I don't know how I did it, because I can't swim. I jumped in the water, and I spit, and I flopped, and I flailed around, but I passed the test. I still don't know how I did that. I started laughing. Or he'd remember the time that he took me fishing, and I don't know where we were fishing, but he had that fishing hat on, and that stubby cigar, and we caught 2 bullheads on 1 hook. He still can't believe that, and he laughed about that. So those were the stories. In the last few months, it got a little bit harder. There were more pauses. He'd forget. It'd take a while to remember, but he'd still come up with different stories, and he'd still laugh about them. A few days before he died, Sarah and I went down to see him. We brought some ice cream down, and he said he really wanted that ice cream sandwich, and he finished the whole thing. It was different because he wasn't sitting in his chair watching a Western or watching TV. He was in bed. He was under the covers. Definitely more frail than I remember my grandpa. He was always a big, strong guy, even back to that road trip in his 90s. We got there, and Sarah was holding his hand, and we were just talking, and she mentioned that Ben and Abby, our son and his fiance, were in Clear Lake. I said, did you ever go over to Clear Lake? Oh, kind of got that twinkle back in his eye. And he smiled. And he started telling a story about going to the surf ballroom. How Wendell would load him up in his car, take him over to the surf ballroom. And he'd talk, he was chuckling and laughing about the fun times they had. And the story that really set him off, he says, there was one night, I don't really remember that night. I don't remember much from inside, but I remember being outside. Oh, it was cold. Must have been 20 below. I think I had a little too much to drink. And he laughed, laughed. So, even right at the end, he was still telling stories. He was still remembering good memories. And then the day that he died, and we got the call, Sally and I drove down. And the staff all talked about how much they liked Lauren. We always smiled at him. And they liked taking care of him. And as I stood there in the room, there was the picture, tucked into a picture of the farm that's in the program today, the one in the upper left corner. And I remember standing there and staring at the picture because there was Grandpa Lauren. He still had that twinkle in his eye that he had when he was 20 or 25, whenever that picture was. He still had it at 98, even in his last days. So that's the laughter and that twinkle. That's what I remember.